They said he followed her into the forest, and by sunrise, only his horse came back. The animal stood at the edge of Dust Hollow just as the first light touched the rooftops, reins dragging in the dirt, sides still warm like it had been ridden hard through the night. But there was no rider, no tracks leading back, just the quiet weight of something unfinished hanging in the morning air. Folks stepped out onto their porches slow, boots pressing into the dry earth, eyes narrowing against the pale gold light stretching across the valley, and nobody spoke at first because out here, silence usually meant something had gone wrong in a way words couldn't fix. Ethan Cole was not a man who vanished. He was the kind who stayed, even when staying hurt, even when the town gave him nothing but sideways looks and half-open doors. He kept to himself mostly, worked cattle on land that barely held water, fixed fences no one else cared about, and nodded when spoken to, though most didn't bother. There was nothing remarkable about him, which is exactly why people noticed when he was gone. The horse shifted its weight, let out a low breath that curled into the cool morning, and one of the older men stepped forward, hand hovering near the reins like he expected them to disappear if touched too quickly. "Where's Cole?" someone asked, though the question had already settled into every chest there. No one answered, because someone had already seen. A boy, maybe 12, standing near the well, spoke up with a voice that didn't quite belong to him yet. He went after her. That was enough to change the air. Not louder, not sharper, just different, like the wind had turned without warning. They all knew who he meant without needing a name. The girl who didn't belong to Dust Hollow, who appeared at the edge of town some evenings like a shadow that chose where to fall. Dark hair, long and unbound, eyes that never lingered on anything long enough to be understood. She never asked for food, never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, only a word or two, soft, measured, like each one had to be chosen carefully. Some said she was Apache. Others said she was something else entirely. What mattered was this: people kept their distance. Not out of fear exactly. More like respect mixed with something they couldn't explain. Ethan hadn't kept his distance. Not that he approached her either. He just watched, the way a man watches the horizon when he's trying to decide if the weather is about to change. It started weeks ago, maybe longer. He'd see her near the tree lean at dusk, standing where the grass gave way to shadow, as if she belonged to neither place. Once, she looked at him. Not past him, not through him, at him, and something in that look stayed. Folks noticed that too, though they pretended not to, because noticing meant admitting there was something there, something they didn't understand. The morning stretched on, and still no sign of Ethan beyond the horse that now stood tied to the post outside the general store, as if waiting for instructions no one knew how to give. Someone muttered about tracks, about organizing a search, but no one moved yet. Because stepping into that forest wasn't like following a trail across open land. The trees out there didn't just block the sun. They swallowed sound, twisted direction. A man could walk 10 yards in and feel like he'd crossed into a place that didn't answer to the same rules. And everyone knew it, whether they said it or not. The boy shifted his feet, eyes fixed on the ground. "She came for him," he added quietly. A few heads turned. "Came?" the older man asked. The boy nodded. "Last night, right at the edge." Didn't say nothing, just stood there. He swallowed. He went to her. That was how it happened then. No struggle, no force, just a man making a choice in the quiet space between one breath and the next. The kind of choice no one else could stop. The kind that didn't ask permission. A breeze moved through town, carrying the dry scent of dust and something cooler from the direction of the trees, and for a moment, it felt like the forest itself was watching, waiting to see what they would do next. But nobody stepped forward. Not yet. Because deep down, each of them understood something they wouldn't say out loud. Ethan Cole hadn't been taken, and whatever waited for him beyond those trees, he had followed it willingly. By noon, the town had gathered without anyone calling for it, drawn by the same quiet unease that settles over cattle before a storm that never shows on the horizon. Boots lined along the wooden walkway outside the general store, hats low, voices kept just above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something that was still deciding whether to reveal itself or not. And the horse, Ethan Cole's horse, stood there still, head lowered, occasionally flicking its ears toward the distant line of trees as if it could hear something the people could not, something soft and far away, something that did not belong to the open land they understood. Sheriff Dalton Reeves arrived last, not in a hurry, but with the kind of steady pace that suggested he already knew this would not be solved with a quick ride and a handful of questions. His eyes moving from the animal to the gathered faces, then to the forest beyond the last fence post. And he did not ask what happened because he had already heard enough before stepping into view. Rumors travel faster than truth in places like this, and they tend to settle in the bones before the mind catches up. "Anyone see where he went in?" he asked, voice even, carrying just enough authority to quiet the murmurs without forcing them to stop completely. The boy near the well pointed without stepping forward, just a small movement of his hand toward a break in the trees where the grass thinned out and the earth darkened, like something had passed there recently, but left no clear mark behind, and that alone was enough to make a few men shift their weight and look away. Dalton followed the direction with his eyes, then walked slowly toward it, boots pressing into the dirt with a deliberate rhythm, not rushing, not hesitating, just measuring each step like he was crossing into a place where time moved differently. The edge of the forest did not welcome or resist him. It simply waited. The light changed first. Out in the open, the sun had been sharp, cutting clean lines across every surface. But here, just a few feet in, it softened, filtered through branches that seemed thicker than they should be, leaves catching the brightness and holding it back like they had no intention of letting it pass without permission. Dalton crouched slightly, studying the ground, but there were no clear tracks, no deep impressions, no broken twigs pointing the way, just a subtle disturbance, like the earth itself had been careful not to remember who walked across it. He did not run, Dalton said after a moment, more to himself than to anyone else, and the statement carried back to the men behind him, settling in their chests heavier than any shouted warning could have. Because running meant fear, and fear was something they knew how to follow. This, whatever this was, felt different. One of the older ranchers stepped closer but stopped short of the shadow line, hat twisting slowly in his hands. "You going in there, Sheriff?" he asked, though his tone already carried the answer he expected. Dalton straightened, eyes still fixed on the dim path ahead, listening, not with his ears alone, but with something deeper, something that had learned over years that silence often spoke louder than noise. There were no birds, no wind pushing through branches, not even the distant creak of wood shifting in the heat. Just stillness, not empty, not dead, just waiting. He took one step forward, just enough for his boot to cross fully into the shade, and paused. The air felt cooler there, but not in the way a shaded place should feel. It was steady, unmoving, like it had been holding that temperature long before the day began and had no intention of changing for anyone passing through. Dalton exhaled slowly, then stepped back, the motion small but final, and turned toward the others. "We wait," he said. A few men frowned. One opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again when he saw the look in the sheriff's eyes. This was not hesitation. It was understanding. "Wait for what?" someone asked from the back. Dalton glanced once more at the trees, then at the horse, then back at the town that had begun to feel smaller than it had that morning. "For him," he said. The words did not carry hope or doubt, just certainty, the kind that did not need to be explained, because deep down, every one of them felt it, even if they could not name it. If Ethan Cole had wanted to come back, he would have, and whatever lay beyond that line of trees, it had not taken him. It had simply let him in. The first time Ethan Cole saw her up close, the sun was already leaning low against the hills, turning the dust in the air into something that looked almost like smoke drifting without purpose. And he had been fixing a broken section of fence near the edge of his land, hands rough with splinters and wire, when he felt it before he saw it. That quiet shift in the world that does not make a sound, but still manages to draw your attention like something just stepped into your shadow without asking. He looked up slow, not startled, just aware, and there she was standing about 20 yards away where the tall grass bent slightly toward the forest, her figure still against the fading light, neither fully in the open nor completely hidden, as if she had chosen the exact place where both worlds touched, but did not mix. She did not wave. She did not speak. She just watched. Ethan straightened, resting one hand on the fence post, the other hanging loose at his side, and for a moment neither of them moved, the kind of stillness that does not feel empty, but full of something waiting to be understood. Most men in Dust Hollow would have turned away or called out, or at least asked what she wanted, But Ethan did none of those things. He simply met her gaze, steady, without challenge, without invitation, just present. The wind moved through the grass between them, carrying the dry scent of earth and something cooler from the trees behind her, and in that space, something passed that had nothing to do with words. She took a step forward then, not toward him exactly, but closer to the line where the fence marked the end of what people in town called theirs, her feet moving quiet, almost careful, and he noticed how she walked, not heavy, not hesitant, but deliberate, like every step had already been decided before it touched the ground. "You should not stay out here after dark," she said finally, her voice low, measured, the words clear but shaped by a rhythm that did not belong to the town behind him. Ethan did not answer right away. He glanced toward the horizon where the last light was thinning out, then back to her. "Been staying out here a long time," he said, his tone calm, not dismissive, just stating something that had already proven itself true. She studied him. For a moment, her eyes not searching for weakness, not measuring strength, but something else entirely, something quieter, and when she spoke again, her words carried a weight that did not match their simplicity. "That is not the same as knowing where you stand." The sentence hung there, and Ethan felt it settle somewhere deeper than he expected, not because it challenged him, but because it sounded like something he had known once and forgotten how to name. He shifted his stance slightly, the wood of the fence pressing into his palm, grounding him in a way that felt necessary. "You lost?" he asked after a moment, though the question felt smaller than what was actually happening. She shook her head once, slow. "No, nothing more. Just that." The quiet returned, but it was different now, not uncertain, but shaped, like the space between them had taken on its own meaning. A crow called somewhere far off, the sound thin and brief, then gone again, and Ethan became aware of how little else there was to hear. Even the usual creak of the fence in the wind seemed to have faded. "Folks in town say you should not be here," he said, not accusing, not warning, just placing the words where they belonged. She did not look back toward Dust Hollow. Her eyes stayed on him. "They say many things they do not understand." There was no anger in it, no bitterness, just truth, stated the way you would describe the weather. Ethan let out a slow breath, not quite a sigh, and nodded once, as if acknowledging something that did not need to be argued. "That sounds about right," he said. A faint change crossed her expression then, not quite a smile, but something close, something that softened the distance without closing it. The light dipped lower, shadows stretching longer across the ground, and for a moment it felt like time itself had slowed to match the pace of their exchange. She turned her head slightly toward the forest behind her, then back to him, and when she spoke again, her voice dropped just enough to feel like it belonged more to the trees than the open land. "There are places where a man can walk for years and never be seen," she said, "and places where he is seen the moment he steps in." Ethan followed her glance. Toward the darkening line of trees, something in his chest tightening not with fear, but with recognition of a choice he had not yet made, but somehow already understood. "And which one is that?" he asked quietly. She held his gaze for a long moment, long enough that the question itself seemed to shift into something else entirely, then answered in a way that did not fully explain and did not need to. "That depends on why he goes." The last light slipped behind the hills then, leaving only a dim glow along the horizon, and when Ethan looked back at her, really looked, he realized something that had not been clear before. She was not waiting for directions. She was not asking for help. She was standing there because she had chosen to be, and somehow, without saying it out loud, she was offering him the same choice. Not now. Not yet. But soon. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan Cole felt the quiet weight of a decision approaching, not from the outside, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere he had not listened to in years. The next evening came slower than it should have, as if the sun itself hesitated before leaving the valley, stretching its light thin across the land while Ethan Cole worked without noticing the hours slipping past, his hands moving out of habit more than purpose, fixing what did not need fixing, checking what had already been checked, because something in him understood that once the light was gone, he would not be standing in the same place anymore, not in the way that mattered. The fence line was straight, the posts firm, the wire pulled tight enough to hold. But he stayed there anyway, eyes drifting more often than not toward the distant edge of the trees where the shadows had already begun to gather, thicker than the rest of the land, like they belonged to something that did not follow the same rules as daylight. He did not expect her to come. That was the part that made it real. There had been no promise, no agreement spoken between them. Just that look, that quiet understanding that had settled somewhere beneath his ribs and stayed there through the night, through the morning, through every small task he tried to lose himself in. A man does not prepare for something like that by packing supplies or saddling a horse. He prepares by not walking away when the moment arrives. The last stretch of sunlight slipped behind the hills, leaving the sky washed in pale orange that faded quickly into blue, then into something darker that pressed gently against the edges of everything familiar, and Ethan finally stopped moving, one hand resting against the top of a post, the other hanging at his side, his breath steady but deeper than usual, like he was listening for something that had not yet made a sound. Then he felt it again. Not a noise, not a movement, just a presence that entered the space the same way it had before, quiet enough to be missed by anyone not already paying attention. He turned his head slightly, and there she was, standing where the open land ended and the forest began, the same distance as before, maybe 20 yards, maybe less, her outline softer now in the dimming light, but no less clear, as if the darkness made her more certain instead of less. She did not step forward. She did not call out. She simply stood there, and for a moment Ethan did not move either, the space between them holding something that felt both fragile and unbreakable at the same time. The wind had settled, the usual sounds of evening fading until even the distant rustle of dry grass seemed to hold back, and in that quiet, the world felt narrower, focused down to a single line between where he stood and where she waited. "You came back," he said finally, his voice low, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging what was already true. She tilted her head slightly, the motion small but deliberate. "You stayed," she replied, and there was something in her tone that carried more weight than the words themselves, something that suggested the difference mattered. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, a faint shift in his shoulders, as if something inside him had settled into place. "Not much reason to leave," he said, though the words felt incomplete even as he spoke them. She took one step then, closing a small part of the distance, her movement smooth, unhurried, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to accept each step without sound. "There are always reasons," she said softly, her eyes never leaving his. "Most of them just belong to other people." The sentence lingered, and Ethan felt it land somewhere deeper than he could easily explain, because he knew that truth, had lived it for years without ever putting it into words. The expectations of a town that never fully welcomed him, the quiet judgments that followed him from one place to another, the sense that staying where he was had never truly been his decision to begin with. He glanced once toward the faint outline of Dust Hollow in the distance, lights beginning to appear one by one like small, cautious signals in the dark, then back to her. "And what about yours?" he asked. "The reasons that belong to you." She held his gaze, steady, unflinching, and when she answered, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried farther than any raised tone could have. "I do not stand where I am told to stand." The words settled between them, and for a moment, the distance that remained felt less like space and more like a threshold waiting to be crossed. Ethan shifted his weight forward slightly, not stepping yet, but no longer rooted in place the way he had been all his life, and he became aware of something that had been building quietly beneath the surface of everything else, something that had nothing to do with fear or curiosity, but with recognition. Not of her alone, but of the choice she represented. The kind of choice that does not come twice. She turned then, not abruptly, not as if she expected him to follow, but as if the next step had already been decided long before either of them arrived at this moment. Her figure angling toward the darker path beneath the trees, where the last traces of light could not reach. She did not look back right away. She did not need to. The invitation was not in her eyes now. It was in the space she left behind. Ethan stood there for one more breath, then another, the sounds of the town behind him faint but present, the open land stretching wide and familiar at his back, and the forest ahead, quiet, steady, waiting. Then, without calling out, without hesitation, he stepped forward, closing the distance that had held him in place, and as his boots crossed from dust into shadow, he felt it immediately, not as a shock, not as something strange, but as something that had been there all along, waiting for him to notice. The air shifted, the light softened, and the world behind him seemed to take a step back, not disappearing, just no longer holding him the same way it once had. She continued ahead, her figure moving between the trees with that same quiet certainty, and this time, Ethan did not stop to question where the path led. Because for the first time in a long while, the direction did not feel like something he had to choose. It felt like something he had finally decided to follow. The forest did not close behind Ethan Cole, but it did not leave a path open either. And after only a few steps, the open land he had known his entire life felt farther away than it should have, as if distance inside this place was measured differently, not in feet or miles, but in decisions already made. The ground beneath his boots softened, not muddy, not unstable, just quieter, the kind of earth that absorbed sound instead of returning it, and he became aware of how loud the world outside had always been without him noticing until now. Ahead of him, Ayana moved with the same steady rhythm, neither slowing nor hurrying, her figure weaving through the trees like she had walked this way more times than could be counted, and for the first time since stepping in, Ethan realized something that settled deep in his chest. She was not checking if he followed. She already knew. The light above filtered through layers of leaves, breaking into soft patterns that shifted without wind, casting shadows that did not quite match the shapes that made them, and every few steps, Ethan found himself glancing back, not out of fear, but out of habit, expecting to see the edge of the forest still within reach. It was not. The trees stood behind him the same as those ahead, tall and quiet, offering no sign of where he had come from. And that was the moment he understood that turning around would not be the same as going back. He slowed slightly, his breath steady but deeper now, his senses adjusting to a place that did not rush to explain itself, and for a brief moment, a question surfaced. Not loud, not urgent, just present. Where does this lead? Ayana stopped then, not abruptly, but in a way that made it clear she had felt the shift in him without needing to see it, and she turned halfway, her face softened by the filtered light, her eyes meeting his with that same calm certainty. You can still leave, she said quietly, and the words did not carry pressure or expectation, only truth. Ethan stood there, the space between them smaller now, maybe 10 yards, maybe less, and he let the words settle without answering right away, because he knew she was not asking if he could walk back. She was asking if he would. He glanced once more behind him, at the place where the trees no longer revealed anything familiar, then forward again to where she stood, and something in his chest shifted, not like a decision being forced, but like one finally being acknowledged. If I go back, he said slowly, it will be the same as before. It was not a complaint. It was not regret. Just a simple truth laid out in the open. Ayana watched him for a moment, then gave the smallest nod, as if that answer had already been part of what she expected. And if you stay, she said, her voice barely rising above the quiet around them, it will not be the same. No promise, no warning, just that. The difference hung between them, and Ethan felt it more clearly than anything he had left behind. He took a step forward, closing the last of the distance, and when he stopped again, he was close enough to see the details he had missed before, the fine lines in her expression, the steadiness in her gaze, the way she carried herself like someone who did not need to prove anything to anyone. You knew I would follow, he said, not accusing, not questioning, just recognizing. She held his eyes and answered in a way that did not fully explain and did not need to. I knew you would decide. The distinction mattered, and Ethan felt it settle into place, removing something he had not realized he had been carrying. He was not led. He was not taken. He had chosen. Ayana turned again, this time stepping deeper between the trees, and Ethan followed without hesitation, his stride falling into a rhythm that matched hers, not forced, not imitated, just aligned. The forest shifted around them as they moved, not in a way that could be seen directly, but in the feeling of it, like walking through a place that noticed you without reacting, that allowed your presence without needing to acknowledge it. The silence was not empty. It was full, layered with something he could not yet name, something older than the town, older than the land as he understood it, and with each step, the weight of what he had left behind grew lighter, not because it no longer existed, but because it no longer held him the same way. After a while, he stopped counting distance altogether. The idea of miles no longer applied. There was only forward, only the steady movement into a place that did not ask him who he had been before. Iana slowed slightly, then stepped aside just enough for him to see what lay ahead, and Ethan's breath caught, not from fear, not from shock, but from recognition of something he had not expected to feel. Not danger, not mystery, but belonging. Faint shapes stood between the trees, structures low and natural, blending into the land rather than standing against it, smoke rising thin and steady into the air above, carrying a scent that felt both unfamiliar and deeply known at the same time. Figures moved in the distance, quiet, unhurried, their presence neither hidden nor displayed, simply existing in a way that made the space feel complete. Ethan did not step forward immediately. He stood there, just inside the edge of what he now understood was not just a forest, but something more, something that existed alongside the world he had known but followed different rules entirely. Iana watched him, not urging, not waiting, just present, and after a moment, she spoke once more. "This is where the path changes," she said softly. Ethan let the words settle, then looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, he understood that this was not about where the path led. It was about whether he would continue walking it. And without saying anything more, without needing to, he took another step forward. The moment Ethan Cole stepped fully into that space, something inside him went quiet in a way it never had before, not the kind of silence that comes from absence, but the kind that settles when a question has finally been answered without needing words, and for a few seconds, maybe longer, he simply stood there, letting his eyes adjust, not just to the light, but to the way things existed here, because nothing felt forced, nothing felt arranged for him. Everything simply was. The structures ahead were not built to be seen from a distance. They revealed themselves only when you were close enough to understand them. Low roofs shaped from wood and earth, smoke rising in thin, steady lines that did not drift far, as if the air itself chose to hold it in place rather than carry it away. And the scent that reached him was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Something warm, something lived in, something that carried the weight of time without the burden of it. Figures moved between the spaces, not many, not crowded, just enough to suggest a life that did not need to announce itself. And when they noticed him, which they did almost immediately, they did not react the way he expected. No tension, no sudden movement, no whispered alarm, just a quiet acknowledgement, like recognizing someone who had arrived when they were meant to. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, aware of himself in a way he had not been moments before, aware of the dust on his boots, the worn edges of his coat, the habits he carried in his posture, but none of it felt out of place here, just different, like something he had been holding on to longer than necessary. Iana stepped forward a few paces, not leaving him behind, not guiding him either, just moving into the space as if it belonged to her in a way that did not need to be claimed. And after a moment, Ethan followed, his steps slower now, not from hesitation, but from attention, taking in details he could not quite name, but did not want to miss. A child passed between two of the structures, glancing at him briefly before continuing on without stopping, and that small moment carried more meaning than anything louder could have, because there was no fear in it, no curiosity that needed to be satisfied, just acceptance of his presence as something that had already been understood. "They know you are here," Iana said quietly, not turning, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without disturbing the stillness around them. Ethan looked toward the figures in the distance, then back to her. "Feels like they knew before I did," he replied, his tone low, not uneasy, just honest. She gave the faintest nod. Sometimes knowing comes before understanding. The words settled into him, and he found himself nodding slightly in return, not because he fully grasped it, but because something in him recognized the truth of it anyway. They moved a little further in, and Ethan noticed how the ground shifted again, not in texture, but in feeling, as if each step was less about moving forward and more about arriving somewhere that had been waiting. And for a brief moment, he became aware of something he had not considered until now. Time. Or rather, the absence of it as he had known it. He could not tell how long he had been walking since leaving the edge of the forest. It did not matter. The idea of hours or minutes felt distant, like something that belonged to a different place entirely. Iana stopped near one of the structures, turning to face him fully now, And for the first time since they had entered this space, there was a shift in her expression, not uncertainty, but something closer to weight, like what she was about to say carried more than just meaning. "This is where you are seen," she said softly. Ethan held her gaze, the words settling deeper than anything else she had said so far, and he understood, not in detail, not in explanation, but in feeling, that being seen here was not the same as being looked at. It was not about who he appeared to be. It was about what remained when all of that fell away. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing in a way he had not noticed they had been tense. And for a moment, he thought about the town, about the way people there looked at him, measured him against expectations he never quite met, and the contrast was not sharp or painful. It was simply clear. "And if I am not who you expect," he said quietly, not challenging, just asking. Ayanna stepped a little closer, her eyes steady, unwavering. "Then you will still be who you are. No judgment, no condition, just truth." The simplicity of it settled into him with a weight that felt almost unfamiliar, because it asked nothing of him except honesty, and that was something he had not been given room for in a long time. He looked past her then, at the people moving through their lives without pause, without performance, and something in his chest shifted again, not a question this time, not even a decision, just a quiet realization. He was not being tested. He was being allowed. The difference mattered more than anything else. Ayanna turned slightly, gesturing toward the space beyond with a movement so small it almost went unnoticed. "You can walk further," she said, "or you can stop here." Ethan followed her gesture with his eyes, then looked back at her, and for the first time since stepping into the forest, he smiled, not wide, not forced, just enough to change the line of his face. "Feels like I already crossed the part that mattered," he said. Ayanna watched him for a moment, then gave a faint nod, as if confirming something she had known all along. And in that quiet space, surrounded by a world that did not need to prove itself, Ethan Cole took another step forward, not because he had to, not because he was led, but because for the first time, the path ahead felt like it belonged to him. The deeper Ethan Cole walked, the less he felt like a stranger, and the more he felt like something that had been missing had finally been returned, not given, not earned, just returned, and it settled into him slowly, the way warmth settles into cold hands, not all at once, but enough to make you realize how long you had been without it. The people moved around him without interruption, their rhythm unbroken, their attention neither fixed on him nor avoiding him, and that absence of reaction carried more meaning than any welcome could have, because it meant his presence did not require explanation. Ayanna walked beside him now, not ahead, not behind, just beside, and that subtle change did not go unnoticed by Ethan, because it spoke of something shifting, something no longer about leading or following, but about walking the same ground for the same reason. They passed a fire where an older man sat shaping a piece of wood with steady hands, his movements precise, unhurried, each cut made with intention rather than efficiency. And as Ethan drew closer, the man looked up, his eyes meeting Ethan's for a brief moment, not questioning, not judging, just seeing, and then he nodded once, a small gesture, almost nothing, but it carried a weight that made Ethan pause for half a breath before continuing. "He knows you," Ethan said quietly, not as a question, but as something he was trying to understand. Ayanna did not look at the man, her gaze forward. "He knows what you carry," she replied. Ethan frowned slightly, the words settling into him in a way that felt heavier than expected. "And what is that?" he asked. Ayanna was silent for a few steps, as if considering not whether to answer, but how much needed to be said. "You will see," she said finally, her tone calm, but there was something beneath it now, something that hinted at a truth not yet fully revealed. They moved further through the settlement, and Ethan began to notice the details more clearly, not just what he saw, but how it felt to see it, the way nothing here seemed to exist for show, nothing arranged to impress or to prove, everything simply present, simply real, and in that realization, something inside him loosened, something that had been tight for so long he had stopped noticing it. They reached a small clearing where the ground opened slightly, the trees stepping back just enough to allow a wider view of the sky above, and in the center stood a structure unlike the others, not larger, not more decorated, just placed in a way that made it feel like a point where everything else quietly connected. Ayanna stopped there, her steps coming to a natural halt, and Ethan followed, his eyes moving from the structure to her and back again. "This is where you decide," she said softly, and the words carried no urgency, no pressure, just a simple statement of what was already happening. Ethan looked at the structure, then at the path behind him, though he could no longer see it. Only remember that it existed somewhere beyond the trees, and for a moment, the two directions did not feel like opposites, but like two parts of the same question. "I already stepped in," he said, his voice steady, not defensive, just certain. Ayanna nodded slightly. Stepping in is not the same as staying. The distinction landed deeper than he expected, because it revealed something he had not fully faced yet, that coming here had been a choice, but remaining would be another, and one did not guarantee the other. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting upward to the opening in the trees where the sky showed through in a muted blue, the light softer here, less direct, and he thought about the town, about the routines, the expectations, the quiet way he had learned to exist without ever feeling fully seen. And then he looked back at the place before him, at the quiet presence of people who had not asked him to be anything other than what he already was. "What happens if I stay?" he asked, not out of fear, but out of respect for the weight of the choice. Ayanna turned to face him fully, her expression steady, but there was something in her eyes now that had not been there before, something closer to honesty without distance. "You will not be the man they knew," she said. Ethan considered that, not as a loss, but as a possibility, and he found that the thought did not unsettle him the way it might have once. "And if I go back," he said. Ayanna held his gaze, and for the first time, there was the faintest trace of something like sadness in her expression, not for him, but for the answer itself. "You will still be the man they never understood." The words settled into the space between them, quiet, final, and Ethan felt them move through him, not as something that needed to be resisted, but as something that clarified what had already been forming inside him since the moment he first saw her at the edge of the trees. He looked around once more, taking in the stillness, the quiet movement of life that did not need to prove itself, and then he looked back at Ayanna, and in that moment, there was no hesitation left, no question waiting to be answered. "Then I think I already made that choice," he said. Ayanna studied him for a long second, then nodded, not in approval, not in surprise, just in recognition of something that had reached its natural end. And without another word, Ethan Cole stepped forward into the center of that clearing, not as a visitor, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had finally stopped walking in circles and chosen a place to stand. The clearing did not change when Ethan Cole stepped into it, but something within him did, something quiet and irreversible, like a door closing without sound, not shutting him out of anything, but sealing him into a place he had finally chosen. And for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, not in anticipation, but in recognition of what had already happened. The people around the edges of the clearing did not gather, did not move closer, but their presence shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a current adjusting direction beneath still water, and Ethan felt it without needing to see it, that he was no longer being observed as someone passing through, but as someone who had arrived. Ayanna stood just behind him now, not guiding, not leading, simply there, and that alone told him more than any words could have, because it meant the path that had brought him here no longer belonged to her alone. It belonged to him as well. The structure at the center of the clearing seemed ordinary at first glance, shaped from the same earth and wood as the others, but there was something in the way it held the space around it, not dominating, not demanding attention, just existing with a quiet gravity that drew the eye without effort. Ethan stepped closer, each movement steady, unforced, and as he did, he became aware of something he had not felt before, not in Dust Hollow, not anywhere else, a sense that he was not carrying his past with him the way he always had. It was not gone. It was simply lighter, as if it no longer needed to define where he stood. He stopped a few feet from the structure, the ground beneath him firm, familiar in a way that felt strange given how little time he had been here, and he looked down briefly at his hands, at the calluses, the marks of years spent working land that never quite gave back what was taken from it. And for the first time, those marks did not feel like something that separated him from others. They felt like something that had brought him here. "You understand now," Ayanna said softly behind him, not asking, not confirming, just speaking into the space that had opened between what was and what had been. Ethan did not turn right away. He let the words settle, let the quiet around him shape them into something deeper than their surface meaning, and then he nodded, a small movement, but one that carried the weight of everything that had led him to this point. "I do not feel lost," he said, his voice low, steady, and the truth of it surprised him not because it was new, but because it had taken this long to say it out loud. Ayanna stepped beside him then, her presence calm, unwavering, and for a moment, they stood together without speaking, the clearing around them holding its quiet rhythm, the distant sounds of movement continuing without interruption, as if nothing had changed and everything had changed at the same time. "They will say you disappeared," she said after a while, her tone neither heavy nor light, just certain. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting upward through the opening in the trees where the sky now carried the deeper blue of evening settling in. "They have been saying that about me for years," he replied, and there was no bitterness in it, only a quiet acknowledgement of something that had always been true in ways he had not fully understood until now. Ayanna studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if that answer aligned with something she had known from the beginning. "And now," she said, "you will not need them to see you." The words settled deeper than any others she had spoken, not because they offered comfort, but because they removed the need for it entirely. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to feel the weight of that truth fully, and when he opened them again, the clearing looked the same, but he did not. He stepped forward once more, passing the threshold of the structure, and as he did, there was no sudden shift, no dramatic change, just a continuation of what had already begun, a quiet unfolding of something that did not need to announce itself to be real. Ayanna remained where she was, just outside, her eyes following him not with concern, not with expectation, but with a calm certainty that did not require outcome. Because the choice had already been made, and inside that simple truth, everything else fell into place. Outside, the clearing, beyond the trees, beyond the line where the forest met the open land, Dust Hollow continued as it always had, the wind moving across dry earth, the town settling into night, and somewhere near the edge, a horse stood tied to a post, its ears flicking occasionally toward the dark line of trees, as if listening for something that would not come. But here, in this place that did not measure time the same way, Ethan Cole did not feel the distance between what was and what had been. He only felt where he stood now. And for the first time, that was enough. Years passed in Dust Hollow the way they always had, marked not by calendars, but by seasons of dry wind and brief rain, by fences repaired and broken again, by cattle driven out and brought back thinner than before, and the town did not change much, not in ways that mattered, except for one thing that never quite settled no matter how much time moved forward. People still spoke of Ethan Cole, though not often, and never loudly, as if saying his name too clearly might invite something they were not ready to understand. At first, they searched, or at least they told themselves they did, riding out in pairs along the edges of the forest, calling his name into the trees that never answered, tracking paths that led nowhere and always seemed to circle back to where they started, until eventually the effort faded, not because they stopped caring, but because something in the silence told them it was not a matter of finding him. It was a matter of accepting that he was not meant to be found. Sheriff Dalton Reeves was the last to give up the search, though even he would not call it that, not out loud, not to anyone else. He would ride out alone sometimes, stopping just short of the tree line, sitting there in the saddle with his eyes fixed on the same place where the boy had pointed that morning, the same place where the ground refused to remember footsteps, and he would wait, not expecting Ethan to walk back out, but listening for something else, something he could not quite name. It never came, and yet, he kept returning, as if the act of showing up was its own kind of answer. The horse had stayed in town for a while, tied outside the general store at first, then moved to a small stable behind it when it became clear no one was coming to claim it, and over time, it settled into a new routine, fed by hands that were not Ethan's, ridden occasionally by a boy who never pushed it too hard, as if he understood without being told that the animal belonged to something beyond the town, something it had not fully left behind. Sometimes, late in the evening, the horse would lift its head suddenly, ears turning toward the distant forest, standing still for long stretches as if listening, and no one ever found a reason for it, though a few stopped asking after a while. Stories formed the way they always do in places like Dust Hollow, quiet at first, then growing in the spaces left by unanswered questions. Some said Ethan had gotten lost and wandered too far to ever find his way back. Others said he had found something out there and chosen it over the life he had known. A few, the ones who spoke less but noticed more, said neither of those things felt right, though they never offered an explanation of their own. Because deep down, each version tried to fit what had happened into something familiar, something that could be understood without changing the way they saw the world. And none of them quite did. Years later, a traveler passed through town, stopping for water and a place to rest before moving on. The kind of man who had seen enough of the land to recognize when a place held more than it showed. And as he sat on the edge of the porch, listening to the wind move through the empty street, he asked the question without knowing why it mattered to him. Anyone ever disappear around here? The men nearby exchanged brief glances, not surprised by the question, but by the way it had been asked, and after a moment, Dalton Reeves, older now, lines deeper in his face but his eyes just as steady, spoke up. One man did, he said. The traveler nodded slowly. You ever find him? Dalton looked out toward the horizon, then beyond it, to the line of trees that had not changed in all those years, and he shook his head once, not as a denial, but as a statement of something more precise. No, he said. Then, after a pause, he added, but we stopped looking. The traveler frowned slightly. Why? Dalton rested his hands on his knees, his gaze still fixed on the forest. Because some men are not meant to be brought back, he said. The words settled into the air between them, and for a moment, the traveler said nothing, as if weighing the meaning behind them. Then he gave a small nod, not fully understanding, but recognizing that understanding was not required. The wind shifted, carrying a faint scent from the direction of the trees, something cooler, something steady, and Dalton closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, before opening them again. Out here, he added quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, a man does not disappear unless he chooses to. And somewhere beyond that line of trees, in a place that did not measure time the same way, where the air held its quiet and the ground remembered only what it needed to, Ethan Cole stood where he had chosen to stand, no longer a man between two worlds, no longer waiting to be seen, but simply present, in a life that did not ask him to prove who he was. And in that stillness, there was no need to return, because nothing of value had been left behind, and nothing of meaning had been taken from him. He had not vanished. He had arrived,